Our penultimate, there's a word for you, our penultimate meeting. These have been great meetings. I think you've gotten a lot out of it. I know I certainly have. And so for our next to last meeting, we are going to focus on revision because that's what we're working on this week. I'm not going to keep you very long. I'm going to go through the revision process. I want to bring you back to the editing bites so you know what's there and you've seen it. And I want to answer any questions you might have, and you can show your screen or you can just ask the questions based on the feedback I gave you on your papers. So everyone should have their papers back, and if you have any other questions, we'll take those as we go. So let's look a little bit at revision. Revision really means to see again. Hopefully there's been some time between writing the paper and reading my feedback, and you're going back now to look again, not only at my comments, but at the comments you're getting from your peers, and for you coming into it saying, what did I write? And I did this all the time. I'm not going to make light of it. While I was getting both of my master's degrees, print out the paper, and I would read it. And I'd say, I can't believe I did that. Sometimes I write email, and I say, I can't believe I've written that. You know, because you write and you think so quickly, but you don't have that time to reread or to see again. This is your opportunity to do that. So students often ask, what's the difference between revision and editing? Because we kind of use those terms loosely as meaning the same thing, and they're not. Editing, if we look at the right side of the screen, is really dealing at the sentence level. It's those little things that I pick out for you. Capitalize this. You have subject-verb disagreement. Put the period here. You forgot to put quotation marks in. You have a spelling error. All of those little remarks, I'm at a very low level. I'm looking at each sentence word for word. And even then, I won't catch everything. I'll see patterns, and you'll see in your paper that from time to time I'll say, okay, I keep seeing this pattern over and over again. Make sure you correct it. I'm not going to point it out every time you do it. So I might point it out 2, 3, 4 times, and then I stop. That doesn't mean you've stopped. It just means that I've stopped pointing it out, and now you have to take that and apply it to your paper. What are some of the sentence level errors that I saw the most? Absolutely, what we talked about in week 2, using first person pronouns and using second person pronouns. You'll go back and read your paper and say, I can't believe I used you so many times. It's just that we write the way we speak. So that's something that I saw over and over and over again. This entire paper is your opinion. You don't need to say I. The whole thing is based on your research, and the whole paper itself is your commentary. Putting, and I think I said this twice, putting I believe, or I think, or in my opinion, or in my research just weakens your credibility. It weakens your ethos because it sounds like you're putting a quantifier in that. I believe. You don't have to believe it, but I believe it. We don't want that. We want you to say things with strength, coming from a position of strength. When you revise, if you look at the left-hand part of the screen, you're really looking at how those sentences work together to form paragraphs and how they're supporting your thesis. So now you're at the content level as opposed to being at a sentence level. If you ask me, and if you're wondering, do you read once for content and edit and then go back and revise? I don't. But then again, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. You may be new to the game of writing or new to the game of writing this type of paper. So I would say for you, your very best bet is to separate these two things. You may want to do the revision first, the actual looking at the content, and we'll talk more in depth on the next slide, and then go back to the editing instead of doing both at the same time. Do you have any questions of me? Okay. Let's look at revision steps. And there you are, writing your revision. saying, but I love this, I can't delete this, this is the best writing I've ever done. And what I'm hearing from students, and certainly it's something that I feel myself, I hate to criticize student writing. I hate to tell them, hey, you missed the boat. But I've had to do that because I owe that to you, to tell you where things don't make sense. And I know that you're trying to do that balancing act in your peer reviews. I put some ideas today. I posted some ideas in each of your group discussions to try to get you to have those conversations in a meaningful way. The very first thing you do is you say something positive. Look at the strengths of the writing and comment on that, whether it's the content or the sentence level structure. Compliment and then say, but here's where I found a problem. I didn't quite understand what you meant by this. Perhaps you can offer a suggestion. That's the very best kind of critique you can do. So when you're looking at your own paper, what is the first thing you're going to do? Reconsider your arguments. Do they make sense? Are they in the order I want them to be in? Review the evidence you've put forward. There were some papers that had absolutely not one shred, not an iota of research. You need at least 3 academic sources. How can you not mention those sources in your paper and have a references page? There were references on the page, but there were no in-text citations. There was no mention of these people. What the references page is saying is, I have given evidence. I have referred to these articles in my paper. I don't see how you can have one without the other. And you know, if you can recall, in one of the discussions, I put in a little blip, little video, 2 minutes, that just explained how, explain the relationship between your references and your in-text citations. So review your evidence.
Professor, one of the things that you had told me that really helped me with getting a little bit of extra length out of my paragraphs too was to use the ethos to the person that you're doing the article. I mean, not the article, but the reference from.
Yes.
That way, if you're saying Dr. Connor told me, states this, well, give them a little bit of who is Dr. Connor, what do they do?
Exactly. And you wouldn't do that, obviously, every time you mention Dr. Connor, but you can mention the article that he wrote that you're referring to, or you can mention his or her ethos, as you said, his or her credibility. Because many times you'll say, Dr. Connor says this, and I go, who's Dr. Connor? And then I'll scroll down to the references page. So you want to help your reader along. You want to, this is a very good point, you want to hold their hand and lead them. Take your time. And it does make things longer, and it gives more credibility to you as a writer. Any other comments on that?
Hey, Professor?
Yeah.
Okay, so we never really discussed, if I wanted to point out several views that, let's say, like Dr. Volok has in regards to the Constitution.
Right.
And I think I emailed you about it, but if I want to span that over 2 or 3 paragraphs, how do you do that without keeping on putting in Volok 2017?
Well, that's a great question. And if you recall back in week 5, we did that, weaving the quotes in and dropping the quotes in with a signal phrase and then putting them in with a full sentence introduction. If you want to get away from saying Dr. what was his name? Volkert says this and says that and said this and stated that, you try to weave the quote in so it becomes more part of your sentence. And that's exactly what you want to be asking yourself, Wes. You want to say, gosh, I'm getting tired of writing the same signal phrases over and over and over again. How do I get around that? And that's when you'll start shifting your writing back to the weaving and back to the full sentence introductions. So go back to that video or go back to the PowerPoint that I sent you and look at that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great questions. There were times that I had to look at essays and I had to ask myself number 3, what is the purpose? And that's a very hard thing to say to somebody who's just handed you 3 or 4 or 5 pages of work, where you get to the point where you say, I've read this and I still don't understand the purpose. I think the only time that will happen is if your thesis is not well wrought. If you don't have a strong thesis, you're going to lose the purpose in the paper. And what happens is you just start throwing thoughts in. And you say, well, how does this one thought in paragraph 1 and this thought in paragraph 2 and 3 and 4, how do they relate to one another? How are they unified to support the thesis? And I would say every time, I would say, first of all, the person had no thesis. The student did not write a thesis, or the thesis didn't answer, so what and who cares? So if you just write something like, very general, like, gun laws exist in the United States, where do you go with that? There's no angle. We all know this. This is obvious. You don't want to write that to a student, dear Captain Obvious. You know, your thesis doesn't shed light on anything. You want to say it in a nicer way, like you don't have an angle here. So you're just going to put any information related to gun laws because you haven't angled it yourself. So review and refine your purpose. Always ask yourself, why am I writing this? What is my intention? Reorganize your paragraphs. Don't be shy about doing this. Sometimes you cut a paragraph because it just doesn't belong there. There are several papers where I've had to say, you need to take this paragraph out and this paragraph out and this paragraph out. And in most cases it was because they were telling personal stories. This paper is based on research. If you have personal stories, you can put it in such a way where you can say it but not use I and me and we. And I know that's a tough thing to do. But if you insist on using personal stories instead of relying on your research, then you have to do it that way. So feel free to reorganize your paragraphs. Earlier in the course, we talked about connotation and denotation and the difference between them. Denotation was your dictionary definition of a word, and connotation was those connotative meanings that dug deeper, that were emotionally based. And when we say refine your prose, you're looking for those places in your essay where you might have slipped out of formal and back into casual language. And that will happen with contractions. That will happen with just the word kid versus the word child. You know, in our own language, just saying my mom versus my mother. One is a more formalized version. So you want to look for those places in your essay where you may have slipped out into a casual prose and move it more towards a more refined formal prose. And prose is anything that's not poetry. That's how you define it. Any questions on this slide?
Hey, Professor, real quick again. If you're citing a dictionary term, like if I'm saying that, let's say that dog is defined as an animal with 4 legs. Do you have to cite where you got that from?
No, because it's a reference book, so it's common knowledge. The only time you'd use a definition is if you were defining a specialized term, and I doubt you'd be getting that from a definition. So if you think of all the terminology unique to the computer, let's say, and you needed to define that term or your reader wouldn't understand, there really is no other reason to define a term in your paper. If you're defining dog in your paper, wow, that's really, I don't know what kind of paper you're writing.
Well, I was defining despotism, and I don't know if everybody knows what despotism is.
You have to assume you're writing to a college audience so that they would know what despotism is. But if you wanted to, you could put it in your own words, but I wouldn't cite the dictionary. And by the way, and I saw this in a few papers, people were citing the dictionary as one of their resources. No. It does not count as a resource, just like Wikipedia. Thankfully, I didn't find any of that. But Wikipedia doesn't count as a resource either. You know, they're reference books, or reference items, I should say.
Professor, I also had a question.
Sure.
I know that in my paper I have a lot of revision to do, but there's certain laws and stuff that I'm going to be going back to. Do I have to put on where I found those legislators, or is that, again, common knowledge?
Depends. If you're saying, like, if it's a common thing that we would all know, like the right to peacefully assemble or peaceably assemble, I think that most of us know that's in the Constitution, so I don't think
Okay.
you have to do that.
Okay.
But if you run into, when in doubt, put your parenthetical citation in.
Okay.
But if you think most people are, or ask me, if you think most people are familiar with it, then you don't have to cite it.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Good. So strategies for revisions. Strategies. Looks like it's spelled wrong, but I don't think it is. Okay. Work from a hard copy. Always, always, always. Print it out. When you're going to revise, when you're going to edit. If you make those two different processes, and again, I think you should, unless you're a professional proofreader, print it out. Get the red pen. Yes, red, I've said it. Get that red pen out and be your own editor. I think the largest amount of points are lost when I become your editor. I'm your teacher. I'm giving you the tools. Now I need for you to use those tools and implement them in a way that shows me that you understand how to use them, that you can leave this course and understand how to put together a thoughtful, well-researched, well-documented paper. And I'm pleased to say that many of you can. But work from a hard copy. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're trying to proofread online. Every time I do it, I do myself a disservice, but when I'm in a rush, I grade your papers from, online. I would do a much more thorough job if I had printed them out and scanned them back to you, but there's just so many hours in a day. Read aloud. I think students forget to do this. Read your paper aloud. You don't need anyone in the room with you. You need to read every one of those sentences aloud. Are there any cases where you read stuff it's I know when I'm sending an email to my boss, I always find myself reading it aloud. If it's important, if I'm sending out a resume, I read that cover page to myself aloud to see the flow, the cadence. Is that the word I want to use? Remember, we talked before about refining your prose. When you hear it said, you might hear the error where your brain might fill it in if you're reading silently. So read your paper aloud. Yes, every word of it. Focus on the assignment. Go back to what the assignment says in the course modules. It tells you there, here's what we expect from this paper. One of the errors I kept seeing are non-academic sources. So in the editing bites, which I'll show you in a moment, I put up the difference between what's considered an academic source versus what's a more popular source. If you're using a newspaper, and that's all good and well, but that's popular. That's not academic. So some of you have to go back now and find those academic sources because you used only popular ones. They can be used, but you still need 3 academic sources in there. I don't want to see people lose points over that. Don't be afraid to cut, add, move, and change. I know it hurts. I know you think it's the best paragraph ever, but if it doesn't belong there or it doesn't make sense, move it, cut it, or change it. And that's being a bold reviser. So, rhetorical concerns. How am I looking at this paper when I grade it? How should you be looking at it? First, judge it for audience, purpose, context, and thesis. Do you have those things? Are you writing for an adult audience of your peers who is schooled and you assume they're educated? Are you writing at that level? Have you established what the purpose of your paper is? And do you have a thesis that connects to that purpose? Then you're going to look at the development. You're looking at the unity of the piece, the coherence. Unity is, does each paragraph talk about one thing? Do you have that one topic sentence in there? Most of the times it's at the beginning, but sometimes it's in the middle and sometimes it's at the end. But that one sentence that says, this is what my paragraph talks about. So if you're doing gun control and you're talking about gun control in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and your first paragraph is, gun control in the 1970s was I'm making this up, much more lax than it is today. Then you should only be talking about the 70s. Or if you do a compare and contrast, 70s versus today, because you said it was much more lax than it is today, so maybe you need to show then and now. But you wouldn't be talking about the history of gun making. Like that doesn't come into play, even though it might be nice for the reader to know. That's not what you promised in that paragraph. So look for the unity. Make sure you're talking about what you promised to talk about in that paragraph. Look for coherence. There were places where I was reading and I said, there's no nice way to say this. I said, this sentence and this sentence do not follow. They're not sequentially related. They're two different things. I don't see how they're related, but if you can't see a relationship, then you better give me a transition that says, on the other hand, or, another aspect to consider is because they seem like they do not follow. So sometimes there's coherent sequencing problems. Look at your evidence and explanations. Think about what Kevin said earlier. Are you establishing the credibility of your researchers? Did you tell us who they were and why we should believe them? How about your explanations, which I did spell incorrectly? I'm sorry, see? How about your own explanations of the quoted material, the research that you put in there? There were, in some papers, I saw 3 or 4 piggybacked quotations. This one said this one said that, this one said this, and this one said that. And I go, wait, where did you go? Where are you in the paper? So, be aware of that in your own papers and as you're looking at your peers' papers. Are they just stringing quotes together? Well, that's not doing anything. What's the purpose of that? And of course, obviously, document your research. And then we're looking at style, mechanics. Again, I apologize. I did this in a hurry. And conventions. So that's a part of it. It's not a huge part of it, but part of it is looking at the punctuation, the grammar, that sentence level stuff I talked about earlier. Do we have any questions on this presentation? Okay, I want to move on to the class itself. This is the editing bites that I put together, and this you'll find in your modules. Maybe I should go back to that. It's right here between course overview and Q&A. If it's moved at all or I moved it, it'll be in this area, but it should be under the course overview. And here every day I publish something in here. So if you are ever unsure, so far I've talked about how do you punctuate titles. And there's Wes. How do you correct run-ons and comma splices? And the comma splice is a form of a run-on. But if I made that, if I gave you that feedback in your paper, that you have a run-on here, you need to correct it. Here are 4 different ways where you can, or several different ways where you can. What kind of things should I avoid in my conclusion? What is a thesis statement? Avoid using contractions. Just very simple. Don't use contractions in academic writing. What's a contraction? Didn't, don't, won't, will, spell it out. Capitalization. Other punctuation. Periods going inside commas. What to do with dashes, semicolons, and question marks. The difference between there, and there. Difference between popular articles and scholarly articles. Use of third-person pronouns in academic writing, and this explains again what's the difference between first, second, and third. So I'm just going to keep posting those up until you post your papers this week so that you have them, and feel free to save them if you think you'll need them at some time in the future. Any questions so far?
Yeah, can you define more about academic citations
Sure.
or references? Because I reference Trey Gowdy in my paper,
Right.
but he's a professional, so he'd be scholar. Yeah, there he is, right there. Bam. Never mind. I'll shut up.
That's good. This is what I want you to get used to, right? So scholars, faculty members, researchers, professionals in their fields, which he is. So if he puts that into, I know you were working with some videos, some YouTube videos, I would consider that on the fringe. It's not a scholarly article, but I think it is scholarly in that where you're getting that information from. But most of the time you're going to find scholarly articles in your databases and in specialized journals. Popular articles are, magazines and newspapers, and they're easy to get a hold of and they're easy to read. But this is what DeVry is looking for, academic articles. So you have to have at least 3 of those. And then if you have a question, email me. Hey, would you consider this a scholarly article?
And am I wrong for using Google Scholar?
No.
Is that an issue? Okay.
That's fine too. No questions there? Okay, so I said I'd give you a little sneak peek into the week 8 assignment, and I want to do that for you because I know there's some question about, well, I'm right up against this paper, I'm studying for other things, what is coming up next week? So, you're going to do a commentary with postscript. And it starts out, we began this class by thinking about different intentions we have of conveying meaning through our written messages. You've been pushed throughout the session to use writing as a means of exploring the world around you. And I'm going to skip down here. In a brief reflective postscript, please answer the following questions as they relate to the writing process throughout the commentary essay. So you're going to answer questions like, what new insights have you gained on your commentary? I think you're talking about that this week as well. You began to conduct and incorporate academic research during the writing process. How well prepared? How do you feel about that? How might you contribute to the public conversation about your commentary topic now that you've invested so much time writing and researching about it? And I think, Wes, today you had mentioned in the discussion that you had always debated this topic, but now you have the research to back up what you're saying. And that's what they're looking for. Did you incorporate changes into your final essay based on your peers' feedback? They'll ask you a little more about that. Did reviewing the work of your classmates help you to understand others' points of view? Did it help you to understand more about writing? And then, did reviewing the work of your classmates provide you with additional writing strategies? Please explain how and why. So that's going to be just 2 pages, double-spaced, and it's how do you get that wrong? It's opinion-based, it's based on your experiences. So that's the last and final thing you're going to do for the class, and I believe it's 75 points. Any questions on that? Does anyone have any questions relative to anything I wrote on their paper that they're just not sure about and they'd like me to address here? Okay. You could always email me, call me, text me, ask me questions, going forward. I'm hoping for the very best outcome. I want to remind you of 2 things. First and foremost, I know I've been harassing everybody, but please, 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 if you haven't already done your evaluation of the course, please do so as soon as possible. They're looking for a good return rate. I'm looking for a good return rate. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this course. I think you have to agree. And I know you have. And I just want that to be reflected. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if there's changes I can make in the future regarding my teaching style, feel free to write that in. If you think I've done a good job, write that in. Whatever you feel. I know there should be a question about changes to the course or things that you thought that maybe could improve the course itself. Please feel free to be honest about that. I do not design the course. I do not design the lessons, so you're not insulting me in any way. If you think, for example, some people say there were too many essays. If that's something you feel, write that into the comments and let them know. And, they'll review that and see if it's valid. In next week, I've asked a couple of you, and any of you can join in and do this, but I've sent you some questions, and I'd really like you to lead a very short, maybe 30-minute, if we have that. I'd like you to lead the WebEx next week and answer the questions that I've given you. If you didn't receive those questions, but you'd like to present, we'd love to hear from you, and I think this will really tell me how much you got out of the course, and it's kind of like those reflective questions you saw in week 8. But I designed them. So I'd like for you to do that, and if you have considered whether you would do that or not, please just shoot me an email and say, yes, I will present next week. You don't have to put anything extraordinary together, 2, 3, 4 PowerPoint slides, just answering those questions is fine. But I'd really like to see you lead the discussions now. Any questions? Then we're good for the night. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good night.
You too.
Good night.
Good night.